It is 1:23 in the morning. You are sleeping in your apartment in Pripyat, a model Soviet city 3 kilometers from the nuclear power plant. A thunderous boom wakes you. From your window, you see something impossible. Reactor number 4 has exploded, and a column of blue light rises toward the sky. The light is beautiful. It shimmers and pulses, unlike anything you have ever seen. Your neighbors are gathering on their balconies, pointing, wondering. Some are walking toward the railway bridge for a better view. Children are being lifted onto their parents' shoulders to see the strange glow. You cannot know that the light is ionized air, that the particles drifting through your open window are radioactive graphite and uranium fuel, that every breath you take is filling your lungs with poison. You do not know that the radiation on your balcony is 100 times the lethal dose. You do not know that the beautiful blue glow is the last thing some of your neighbors will ever see. Welcome to Chernobyl. Before we go any further, I need you to do something for me. If you're new to this channel, hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon so you never miss another journey into historical darkness. And if you're already subscribed, you know the drill. Leave a like on this video. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. It helps more than you know. And honestly, the people of Pripyat could have used some warning too. Now, where were we? Ah, yes. The reactor has exploded, and you are standing in a cloud of invisible death. The Chernobyl disaster of April 26, 1986, was the worst nuclear accident in history, a catastrophe that released 400 times more radiation than the Hiroshima bomb, contaminated vast swaths of Europe, and created a dead zone that remains uninhabitable nearly 4 decades later. It was a disaster born of Soviet secrecy, institutional arrogance, and a flawed reactor design that was a state secret, even from the men who operated it. But Chernobyl is more than a technical failure. It is a human story of the firefighters who climbed onto the burning roof, not knowing they were already dead. Of the liquidators who shoveled radioactive graphite with 90 seconds to live. Of the miners who dug beneath the reactor in temperatures that cooked them alive. Of the widows who watched their husbands dissolve over days and weeks, forbidden even to touch them. Over the next few hours, we're going to explore what really happened at Chernobyl. The design flaws that made the disaster possible. The human errors that triggered it. The heroism that prevented it from becoming even worse. And the long, slow dying that continues to this day. This is the brutal reality of the Chernobyl disaster. Get comfortable. The reactor is burning. The Soviet Union believed in atoms. Nuclear power was not just an energy source. It was proof that communism could master nature itself. That socialist science could outperform the decadent West. That the workers' paradise would be lit by the power of the atom. The dream began in 1954, when the USSR opened the world's first nuclear power station at Obninsk. It was small, just 5 megawatts, but it was first, and being first mattered enormously to Soviet pride. While the Americans had used the atom to destroy Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Soviets would use it to build a better world. The nuclear program expanded rapidly through the 1960s and 70s. Power stations rose across the Soviet Union, each one a monument to technological progress. The propaganda was relentless. Nuclear power was safe, clean, and limitless. Soviet reactors were the best in the world. Soviet engineers were the best in the world. Nothing could go wrong. The centerpiece of this program was the RBMK reactor, a uniquely Soviet design that could produce both electricity and plutonium for weapons. The RBMK was huge, powerful, and cheap to build. It could be refueled while running, maximizing output. Ionized graphite as a moderator, which was abundant. It was, the Soviets believed, the reactor of the future. But the Soviets did not publicize what was classified as state secrets were the RBMK's flaws. The reactor had a positive void coefficient, meaning that under certain conditions, a loss of coolant would cause power to increase rather than decrease. This was the opposite of how Western reactors behaved. It meant the RBMK could, under the wrong circumstances, accelerate out of control. The engineers who designed the RBMK knew about this flaw. The operators who ran the reactors did not. The information was classified. To admit the flaw would be to admit that Soviet technology was imperfect, and that was ideologically unacceptable. So the reactors kept running, and the operators kept operating them in ignorance. And the bomb kept ticking. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant sat in northern Ukraine, near the border with Belarus, in a landscape of forests and marshes. Construction began in 1970, and by 1986, 4 reactors were operational, with 2 more under construction. It was one of the largest nuclear facilities in the world. Reactor Number 4 was the newest of the operating units. Having come online in 1983, it was a standard RBMK 1000, capable of producing 1,000 megawatts of electrical power. Like its siblings, it was considered safe, reliable, and thoroughly Soviet. The reactor core was enormous, a cylinder of graphite blocks, 7 meters tall and 12 meters in diameter, containing 1,661 fuel channels filled with uranium fuel rods. Water flowed through the channels, cooling the fuel and generating steam to drive the turbines. The graphite moderated the nuclear reaction, slowing neutrons to the optimal speed for sustaining the chain reaction. Above the reactor sat a massive steel and concrete lid, the upper biological shield, nicknamed Alina by the workers. It weighed 1,000 tons and was designed to contain any accident, to keep radiation inside no matter what happened. It would prove inadequate to its task. The control room of Reactor Number 4 was a cathedral of Soviet technology banks of switches, dials, and indicators, manned by engineers who had been trained to believe their reactor was safe. They had procedures for every contingency, protocols for every emergency. What they did not have was the truth about their reactor's behavior at low power information that was classified, forbidden, and would have saved their lives. On the night of April 25, 1986, the night shift arrived for what was supposed to be a routine safety test. None of them knew they were about to trigger the worst nuclear disaster in history. If you're enjoying this descent into nuclear catastrophe, take a moment to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow, and I promise the explosion is coming soon. The safety test scheduled for April 25 to 26 was supposed to be straightforward. The goal was to determine whether the reactor's turbines could generate enough power during a shutdown to keep the coolant pumps running until the emergency diesel. Generators kicked in a gap of about 45 seconds. This was actually an important safety question. In the event of a power failure, the reactor would need continuous cooling, and there was a brief window when neither the grid nor the generators could provide it. The test would simulate the scenario and measure whether the spinning turbines could bridge the gap. The test had been attempted before in 1982, 1984, and 1985, but had never been completed successfully. Each time, something had gone wrong, not catastrophically, but enough to invalidate the results. This time, the plant's deputy chief engineer, Anatoly Dyatlov, was determined to complete it. Dyatlov was 55 years old, a veteran of the Soviet nuclear program, and a man with a reputation for bullying subordinates. He was also the highest-ranking official on site that night, and his word was law. When operators expressed concerns about the test, Dyatlov overruled them. When safety procedures got in the way, Dyatlov ignored them. The test was supposed to begin during the day shift, but the Kiev electrical grid demanded the reactor remain at full power to meet demand. The test was postponed until 11 p.m., when a new shift less experienced, not briefed on the test, took over. By the time the test finally began, the reactor had been in an unstable state for hours, and the men in the control room did not fully understand what they were dealing with. The stage was set for disaster. The problems began almost immediately. To conduct the test, the reactor needed to be brought down to about 700 megawatts low power, but stable. Instead, due to a combination of operator error and the reactor's inherent instability, power plummeted to just 30 megawatts at this level. The reactor was effectively poisoned. A byproduct of the nuclear reaction called xenon 135 was building up in the core, absorbing neutrons and suppressing the chain reaction. Under normal procedures, the operator should have shut down and waited 24 hours for the xenon to decay. But Dyatlov wanted the test completed. He ordered the operators to raise power to do this. The operators withdrew most of the control rods, the graphite-tipped rods that regulated the nuclear reaction. Protocol required at least 30 rods to remain in the core at all times. The operators withdrew all but 6 or 8. The reactor was now operating far outside its design parameters. Balanced on a knife's edge by 1:23 a.m. The reactor had stabilized at about 200 megawatts less than planned, but enough for the test. Dyatlov ordered the test to proceed. The operators closed the steam valves to the turbines, simulating a power failure, and watched to see if the spinning turbines could power the pumps. Almost immediately, things went wrong. With the steam valves closed, the coolant flow decreased. Water in the fuel channels began to boil. And here, the fatal flaw of the RBMK design revealed itself. As steam voids formed in the coolant, the reactor did not shut down. It accelerated. Power began to rise slowly at first, then faster. The automatic shutdown systems had been disabled for the test. The operators, realizing something was wrong, hit the emergency shutdown button IZ5 to drop all the control rods back into the core dot. It was the worst thing they could have done. The AZ5 button was supposed to stop the reactor. Instead, it destroyed it. Here was the final fatal flaw of the RBMK design. The control rods were tipped with graphite. When the rods first entered the core, the graphite tips displaced water at the bottom of the fuel channels. Graphite was a better moderator than water. It accelerated the reaction rather than slowing it. For a few seconds, before the neutron-absorbing portion of the rods could take effect, pressing a Z5 actually increased power dot in a stable reactor. This brief spike would have been manageable. But reactor number 4 was not stable. It was already accelerating out of control, and the graphite tips added fuel to the fire. Power surged from 200 megawatts to 30,000 megawatts, 100 times the reactor's rated capacity in less than 4 seconds. The uranium fuel, superheated beyond any tolerance, shattered. The pressure in the fuel channels exceeded 1,000 atmospheres. The channels ruptured, and steam exploded into the reactor space dot at 1 hour 23 minutes and 45 seconds a.m. on April 26, 1986. The first explosion tore through reactor number 4. The 1,000-ton upper shield, Elena, was blown straight up, then crashed back down at an angle, exposing the burning reactor core to the open air. 2 seconds later, a second explosion followed. This one was probably a steam explosion, though some scientists believe it may have been a nuclear excursion, a brief, uncontrolled criticality. The second blast was more powerful than the first, destroying the reactor building and scattering radioactive debris across the plant grounds. Now the reactor was gone. In its place was a crater of burning graphite, exposed fuel, and radiation levels that would kill a human being in minutes. The worst nuclear accident in history had begun. If you're settling in for the night, now's a good time to hit that subscribe button and leave a comment, because we're about to meet the men who ran toward the burning reactor while everyone else ran away. The explosion was heard throughout Pripyat. At the fire station, alarm bells rang, and the firefighters of the city ordinary men who had trained to fight ordinary fires scrambled to respond. They had no idea what they were facing. The first fire brigade arrived at the plant within minutes, led by Lieutenant Vladimir Pripyat, 23 years old. What he saw was unlike any fire he had trained for. The roof of the turbine hall was burning. Flames were shooting from the destroyed reactor building, and strange glowing chunks were scattered across the ground. The air tasted of metal. Pripyat did what firefighters do. He ordered his men to climb to the roof and fight the fire. He did not know, could not know, that those glowing chunks were pieces of the reactor core, graphite blocks so radioactive that standing near them meant death. He did not know that the air he was breathing was carrying particles of uranium and plutonium into his lungs. Lieutenant Viktor Kibinok arrived with the 2nd Brigade and joined Pripyat on the roof. Together, the two young commanders directed their men in a desperate battle against fires that should have been left to burn. They poured water on flames that were fueled by nuclear fission. They kicked aside pieces of graphite to clear paths for their hoses. They absorbed lethal doses of radiation with every passing minute got by 6:35 a.m. The fires on the roof had been extinguished. The reactor itself was still burning. It would burn for 10 days, but the immediate threat of the fire spreading to the other reactors had been stopped. The firefighters had saved the plant from becoming an even greater catastrophe. The cost was their lives, the firefighters. On the roof of reactor number 4, absorbed radiation, doses that would have been fatal even with modern medical treatment. In 1986, it was no hope at all. The first symptoms appeared within hours. The men began vomiting uncontrollably, a classic sign of acute radiation syndrome. Their skin, which had been exposed to direct radiation and contaminated with radioactive dust, began to redden and blister. They felt weak, dizzy, disoriented. Some collapsed before they could leave the roof. Those who could still walk were taken to the Pripyat hospital, which was quickly overwhelmed. The doctors there had no experience with radiation injuries and no proper equipment to treat them. They did not even have dosimeters to measure how much radiation the men had absorbed. They could only treat the symptoms and hope that, by the afternoon of April 26th, it was clear the firefighters needed specialized care. They were flown to Moscow, to Hospital Number 6, the Soviet Union's only facility equipped to treat severe radiation injuries. Dr. Angelina Gaskova, the world's leading expert on radiation sickness, took charge of their care, but Gaskova knew the truth. Most of these men were going to die. The radiation had destroyed their bone marrow, their immune systems, their ability to heal. Over the coming days and weeks, their skin would slough off, their organs would fail, and they would die in agony while their families watched helplessly. 6 firefighters from that first response died within a month. Vladimir Pravik, Viktor Kibanok, Nikolai Veshuk, Vasily Ignatenko, Vladimir Tishura, and Nikolai Taiknok. They were the first of many. They were also the first heroes. While the firefighters battled the blaze, the citizens of Pripyat gathered to watch. The best view was from the railway bridge on the edge of town, about 3 kilometers from the reactor. That night, dozens, perhaps hundreds of people stood on the bridge, watching the fire, wondering what had happened. The view was spectacular. The ruined reactor glowed against the night sky, flames and sparks shooting upward. The strange blue light Cherenkov radiation, caused by particles traveling faster than light, through the air pulsed and shivered. Some people brought their children. Some brought picnics. They stood for hours, watching the show. They did not know they were standing in a plume of radioactive fallout. The wind was carrying contaminated particles directly over the bridge, and everyone who stood there was breathing them in, absorbing them through their skin, taking them home on their clothes. The radiation dose on the bridge that night was estimated at 500 roentgens per hour, a lethal dose in minutes. The bridge became known as the Bridge of Death. According to local legend, everyone who stood there that night eventually died of radiation-related illness. This cannot be confirmed. Soviet records are incomplete, and many of the witnesses were never tracked. But the physics are clear. Anyone who spent significant time on that bridge absorbed a fatal or near-fatal dose. The people on the bridge were not heroes or responders. They were ordinary citizens, curious about a strange event, unwarned by authorities who were still pretending nothing serious had happened. They died, if they died, because their government lied to them, because the culture of Soviet secrecy was more important than their lives. The reactor exploded at 1:23 a.m. By 3 a.m., the plant director, Viktor Bryakonov, was on site, surveying the damage. What he saw was unmistakable. The reactor building was destroyed. The core was exposed. Fires were burning everywhere. The situation was catastrophic, but Bryakonov did not report a catastrophe. He reported a fire and a partial roof collapse. The initial messages to Moscow described an accident with the reactor, suggesting the core was intact and the situation was under control. The radiation levels reported were wrong by a factor of thousands. The dosimeters available had maximum readings that were far below the actual levels. This was not simply incompetence, though incompetence played a role. This was Soviet culture in action. To report a disaster of this magnitude would be to admit that Soviet technology had failed, that Soviet engineers had made mistakes, that the Communist Party's assurances of safety had been lies. Career-ending accusations could follow. Criminal charges. The gulag was no longer common, but the fear remained. So the reports went to Moscow, and the reports minimized. The Kremlin received information that suggested a serious but manageable accident. The Politburo met and decided to wait for more information. Hours passed. The reactor continued to burn, spewing radiation into the atmosphere. The people of Pripyat continued to go about their lives, unknowing that by the time the full truth reached Moscow, by the time Soviet leaders understood, they were facing the worst nuclear disaster in history. More than 24 hours had passed. The window for effective evacuation, for protective measures, for limiting the damage, had closed. The lies had cost lives. If you're still with me in the shadow of the burning reactor, take a moment to hit subscribe. Your support helps me create more historical deep dives. And speaking of shadow, let's discuss what the people of Pripyat experienced in the hours after the explosion. The city of Pripyat woke to a beautiful spring morning. The sun was shining, the air was warm, and it was Saturday, a day off for most workers. Families had plans, picnics, fishing trips, a football match at the local stadium. Life went on as normal. Almost normal. There were rumors, of course. The explosion had been heard throughout the city, and some people had seen the fire from their windows. Word spread that there had been an accident at the plant, that some workers had been injured, that the firefighters had been busy all night. But officials said there was nothing to worry about. The situation was under control. The radiation, however, did not care about official statements. By morning, Pripyat was blanketed with invisible contamination. The air carried radioactive particles. The ground was dusted with fallout. The trees, the grass, the playgrounds, everything was hot. The residents could not see the danger, but some could feel it. A strange metallic taste in the mouth. A prickling sensation on the skin. Headaches, nausea, a feeling of unease that could not be explained. Those who had been outside for long periods began to feel ill. But without information, without warning, they had no idea that the illness was connected to the plant. The authorities knew. By midday on April 26th, radiation readings in Pripyat were hundreds of times above safe levels. But the evacuation order did not come. The people of Pripyat would spend another 36 hours in a city that was slowly poisoning them. The image is unbearable. While the reactor burned and the air filled with poison, the children of Pripyat played outside. It was Saturday, April 26, 1986, and the weather was perfect. Parents sent their children to the parks, to the playgrounds, to the football pitches. Schools organized outdoor activities. Families ate lunch on their balconies, enjoying the spring sunshine. No one told them to stay inside. The children ran through grass, contaminated with cesium-137 and strontium-90. They played in sandboxes where plutonium particles had settled. They breathed air carrying iodine-131, which concentrated in their thyroid glands, planting the seeds of cancer that would bloom years later. They did what children do, and no one stopped them. The authorities knew. By Saturday afternoon, the Soviet government had confirmed that the reactor core was exposed, that massive amounts of radiation were being released, that Pripyat was in immediate danger. They knew the children should be indoors, should be taking potassium iodide tablets, should be evacuated. They did nothing. Why? Because to act would be to admit the disaster. Because the May Day celebrations were a week away, and panic would spoil the festivities. because the instinct of the Soviet system was always to suppress bad news, to control the narrative, to maintain the illusion of competence. The children paid for this instinct with their futures. The thyroid cancer rate among children exposed to Chernobyl would eventually be 100 times the normal rate. Many of the children who played outside on April 26, 1986, would develop cancer in their teens or 20s. Some would die. Others would live with the consequences forever. For 36 hours after the explosion, the Soviet government said almost nothing. Internally, officials knew the truth. Externally, they maintained silence, even as the radioactive cloud drifted across. Europe. The first external indication that something had happened came not from Moscow, but from Sweden. On Monday, April 28th, workers at the Forsmark nuclear power plant in Sweden set off radiation alarms when they arrived for their shifts. The plant was evacuated, and scientists began testing for the source of contamination. They quickly determined it was not coming from Forsmark. It was coming from the east. Swedish diplomats contacted Moscow, asking about a possible nuclear accident. The Soviets denied everything. It was not until Monday evening, more than 60 hours after the explosion, that TASS, the Soviet news agency, issued a brief statement acknowledging an accident at Chernobyl. The statement said the situation was being dealt with and provided almost no details. Meanwhile, the radioactive cloud continued to spread. It passed over Finland, Norway, Poland, Germany. It reached Italy, France, the United Kingdom. Radiation levels spiked across the continent. Governments that had received no warning from the Soviets scrambled to measure the contamination and protect their citizens. The secrecy was not just diplomatic failure, it was murder. People across Europe were exposed to radiation without warning, without protective measures, without any way to minimize their risk. The Soviet government had chosen to protect its reputation rather than protect lives. The lies would continue for years. The death toll would be understated, the health effects denied, the full extent of the disaster concealed. The truth about Chernobyl would emerge slowly, painfully, incompletely. It is still emerging today. Doubt if you're settling in for sleep. Subscribe and leave a comment about what historical topic you'd like me to cover next. Because now we're going to empty a city dot at 11 a.m. on Sunday, April 27th, to 36 hours after the explosion. The evacuation of Pripyat finally began. The announcement came over loudspeakers and radio. All residents must prepare to leave. The evacuation would be temporary. They should bring documents, food for 3 days, and essential items only. They would return soon. They would never return within 3 hours. 1,100 buses arrived in Pripyat, mobilized from Kiev and surrounding regions. The evacuation was remarkably efficient, a testament to Soviet organizational capability when properly motivated. By 5 p.m., the city was empty. 49,360 people had been removed in less than 6 hours. The residents left behind almost everything. Their apartments remained as they had left them. Breakfast dishes on tables, clothes in closets, toys on floors. They left pets behind, thinking they would return in days. They left photo albums, heirlooms, the accumulated possessions of their lives. All of it would remain, slowly decaying in the abandoned city. The evacuation zone expanded over the following days and weeks. A 10-kilometer zone was established, then a 30-kilometer zone. More than 300,000 people would eventually be relocated from contaminated areas in Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. It was the largest peacetime evacuation in history. Some people refused to leave. The self-settlers, mostly elderly residents, who preferred the familiar dangers of home to the unknown terrors of relocation, drifted back into the exclusion zone over the following months and years. They lived in abandoned villages, grew their own food, drank contaminated water. Many are still there today. The Chernobyl exclusion zone is a 2,600 square kilometer area of abandoned land, roughly circular, centered on the destroyed reactor. Within its borders, time has stopped and nature has taken over. The zone was established in the days after the accident, as the scale of the contamination became clear. Everyone within 30 kilometers of the reactor was evacuated. Checkpoints were established on every road. The military patrolled the borders. Entry was forbidden. Inside the zone, villages stand frozen in 1986. Houses with their roofs collapsing, their walls crumbling, their interiors reclaimed by vegetation. Schools with books still on desks, classrooms still decorated for May Day celebrations that never happened. Collective farms with rusting machinery, overgrown fields, the bones of animals that were shot to prevent contamination spread. Pripyat is the ghost city at the zone's heart. The apartment blocks still stand, their windows empty, their balconies draped with vines. The amusement park that was supposed to open on May 1st, 1986, remains frozen. Ferris wheel motionless, bumper cars rusting, never ridden. The swimming pool, which operated for liquidators until 1998, is drained and cracked. The city is a monument to sudden absence. The radiation levels in the zone vary wildly. Some areas have returned to nearly normal background levels. Others remain lethally hot. The red forest, a stand of pine trees that absorbed so much radiation they turned red and died, was bulldozed and buried, but the soil remains contaminated. Hot spots can be found anywhere, in gutters, in moss, in the rusting hulks of abandoned vehicles. The zone will remain contaminated for centuries. Some isotopes will decay within decades. Others, like plutonium-239, have half-lives of 24,000 years. The exclusion zone is not a temporary measure. It is permanent, or as close to permanent as human. Timescales can comprehend. The disaster required a response on a scale the world had never seen. Over the following months and years, approximately 600,000 people were sent to Chernobyl to deal with the consequences of the explosion. They were called liquidators, and their sacrifice prevented an even greater catastrophe. The liquidators came from across the Soviet Union soldiers, reservists, miners, construction workers, scientists, volunteers. Many were conscripted. Others volunteered, motivated by patriotism, money, or simply the belief that it was the right thing to do. They had varying levels of training and varying levels of understanding about what they faced. Their tasks were diverse and uniformly dangerous. They shoveled radioactive debris. They demolished contaminated buildings. They washed streets, roofs, and vehicles. They buried contaminated soil and equipment. They built the concrete sarcophagus over the destroyed reactor. They did whatever was necessary. The protection they received was minimal. Some had respirators. Many did not. Dosimeters were often unavailable or deliberately set to not record the true levels. The liquidators were told they would receive a certain dose and then be rotated out, but the records were frequently falsified, and many received far more radiation than officially acknowledged. The health consequences were severe. Studies of liquidator health have shown elevated rates of cancer, cardiovascular disease, cataracts, and psychological disorders. Many died young. Those who survived often suffered chronic health problems. The Soviet Union, and later Russia and Ukraine, provided varying levels of support, often inadequate to the needs. The liquidators are honored as heroes in the former Soviet states. They deserve to be. Without their sacrifice, the disaster would have been far worse. They saved Europe from a catastrophe that could have made much of the continent uninhabitable. If you're still with me among the liquidators, take a moment to hit subscribe. Your support helps me create more historical deep dives. And speaking of desperate measures, let's talk about the men who did what machines could not. After the explosion, chunks of highly radioactive graphite and reactor fuel were scattered across the roof of Reactor Number 3, adjacent to the destroyed unit. This debris needed to be cleared before the roof could be sealed, but the radiation levels were so high that conventional methods were impossible. The Soviets tried robots first. West German and Japanese machines were brought in, but the radiation fried their circuits within minutes. The electronics could not withstand the bombardment. The robots failed dot, so they sent men. They called them biorobots, a grim joke that captured the situation exactly. Where machines could not function, human beings would have to do. The men would run onto the roof, shovel debris over the edge, and run back. They had 90 seconds. Any longer, and they would receive a lethal dose. The biorobots wore lead aprons and lead-lined goggles, but these provided minimal protection. The radiation on the roof exceeded 10,000 roentgens per hour in some areas, enough to kill in minutes. The men worked in relays, run out, shovel, run back. Each man could only go once. Some areas were so hot that even 90 seconds was too long. Approximately 3,500 men served as biorobots on the roof of Reactor Number 3. Their service earned them certificates and modest bonuses. Many received radiation doses, far in excess of what was recorded. Many suffered health consequences that followed them for the rest of their lives. They cleared the roof. The impossible job was done. The cost was measured in human bodies. The reactor core was still burning, still releasing radiation, and it needed to be extinguished. The solution was to drop material onto the fire from above, but this meant flying helicopters directly over the open reactor. Through radiation levels that could disable both equipment and crew, the helicopter pilots who flew these missions knew what they were doing. They knew the radiation could kill them. They flew anyway. The plan was to drop a mixture of sand, lead, clay, and boron onto the burning reactor. The sand would smother the fire. The lead would absorb radiation. The boron would absorb neutrons and help stop the nuclear reaction. Over the first 10 days after the explosion, helicopters made approximately 1,800 drops, depositing 5,000 tons of material onto the reactor. The pilots flew at low altitude directly over the crater, hovering low enough to release their loads. Each pass exposed them to intense radiation. The helicopters themselves became so contaminated that some had to be abandoned. The pilots rotated frequently, but many received doses that would affect their health for years. Not all the missions went smoothly. On October 2, 1986, a Mi-8 helicopter clipped a construction crane while maneuvering near the reactor and crashed. All 4 crew members were killed, the only deaths directly caused by the disaster's cleanup operations, though thousands more would die slowly from radiation exposure. The airdrops were later criticized as possibly counterproductive. The weight of the material may have contributed to the reactor's continued burning and the risk of a steam explosion. But at the time, with incomplete information and desperate urgency, the helicopter pilots did what they were asked. They flew into the heart of the disaster, again and again. Beneath the burning reactor, an even greater danger lurked. The molten core was burning its way downward, and below the reactor sat a bubbler pool, a large water reservoir used for emergency cooling. If the molten fuel reached the water, the resulting steam explosion could be catastrophic, potentially destroying the other reactors and spreading contamination across an even wider area. To prevent this, the water had to be drained, but the valves were underwater in a flooded basement in near total darkness, with radiation levels that made the mission potentially lethal. 3 plant workers, Alexei Ananenko, Valery Bispalov, and Boris Baranov, volunteered to go in. They waded through radioactive water, found the valves, and opened them. The bubbler pool drained. The immediate danger passed, but the molten core was still sinking. Beneath the bubbler pool was a concrete foundation, and beneath that was soil, and beneath that was the water table. If the core reached the groundwater, it could contaminate the drinking water for millions of people across Ukraine and Belarus. The solution was to dig a tunnel beneath the reactor and install a cooling system. The job required miners men accustomed to working underground in heat in cramped spaces. Miners were brought from across the Soviet Union, particularly from the Tula coal region, to dig beneath Chernobyl. The conditions were hellish. The tunnel was hot. Temperatures exceeded 50 degrees Celsius, 122 degrees Fahrenheit. The radiation, while lower than on the surface, was still significant. The men worked in shifts, stripped to their underwear because of the heat, digging around the clock. They completed the tunnel in just over a month, installing a concrete slab to prevent the core from reaching the groundwater. Many of the miners suffered health consequences. The exact toll is disputed, but respiratory diseases, cancers, and early deaths were common. They had saved the water supply for millions. The cost was their own bodies. If you're settling in for sleep, subscribe and leave a comment. Because now we need to entomb a monster. The immediate fires were out. The roof was cleared. The groundwater was protected. But the reactor itself remained a burning, radiating, lethal ruin that needed to be contained. The solution was the shelter object, known colloquially as the sarcophagus, a massive concrete and steel structure built to entomb. Reactor Number 4. Construction began in May 1986 and was completed in November, an astonishing feat of engineering under the worst possible conditions. The structure used 400,000 cubic meters of concrete and 7,000 tons of steel. It was built by remote control where possible, but much of the work required human hands, exposing workers to significant radiation. The sarcophagus was never intended to be permanent. It was built fast, under extreme conditions, with the primary goal of stopping the immediate release of radiation. The designers knew it would eventually fail. They estimated it might last 20 to 30 years. They were right. By the 2000s, the sarcophagus was deteriorating. Cracks had formed in the concrete. The roof was unstable, with holes that allowed rainwater to enter. The structure was at risk of collapse which could release a new cloud of radioactive dust. Something had to be done. The solution was the new safe confinement, a massive arch-shaped structure, larger than the Statue of Liberty, designed to be slid over the old sarcophagus. Construction began in 2010 and was completed in 2016. The new safe confinement is designed to last 100 years, providing time to eventually dismantle the reactor and dispose of the radioactive material. Inside the sarcophagus, the remains of Reactor Number 4 still sit. The elephant's foot, a mass of melted fuel, concrete, and sand remains so radioactive that a few minutes of exposure would be fatal. The tomb is sealed, but the monster inside is still alive. The most severely irradiated victims of Chernobyl were sent to Hospital Number 6 in Moscow, the Soviet Union's specialized facility for treating radiation injuries. What happened there was both heroic medicine and prolonged horror. The firefighters arrived first, flown in by helicopter on April 26th and 27th. Dr. Angelina Goskova, who had spent her career studying radiation sickness, took charge of their care. She had treated victims of previous Soviet nuclear accidents, events that were kept secret from the world, and she knew what was coming. Acute radiation syndrome progresses in stages. First comes the prodromal phase, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, as the body reacts to the initial assault. Then a latent period, days to weeks of apparent improvement, during which patients may feel better even as their bone marrow is dying. Finally, the manifest illness, infections, bleeding, organ failure, death. The firefighters followed this progression with textbook precision. After an initial period of severe illness, some seemed to recover, but their blood counts continued to drop, white cells, red cells, platelets, all falling toward zero. Their immune systems were collapsing. Their bodies were losing the ability to heal. The hospital tried everything available. Bone marrow transplants were attempted, with tissue donated by relatives. The American Dr. Robert Gale flew to Moscow to assist, bringing expertise in radiation treatment. Patients were kept in sterile isolation, given transfusions, treated aggressively for infections. It was not enough. The radiation had destroyed too much. Skin sloughed off in sheets. Internal organs failed. Patients died in agony over days and weeks, their families watching helplessly from behind glass. 28 people died of acute radiation syndrome at Chernobyl. Most of them died in Hospital Number 6. The wives of the firefighters came to Moscow. They were not allowed to touch their husbands. Lyudmila Ignatenko, whose husband Vasily was one of the first responders, would later describe watching him die over 14 days. When she arrived at the hospital, he looked almost normal, sunburned, perhaps, but recognizable. By the end, he did not look human. The radiation had destroyed him from the inside out. The doctors warned the wives not to touch, not to kiss, not to get close. The patients were themselves radioactive, their bodies contaminated, their tissues emitting particles. To touch them was to absorb radiation, but the wives touched anyway. They held hands, kissed foreheads, embraced the men who had been their partners. Love does not obey dosimeters. Lyudmila was pregnant. The doctors did not know this at first, and she did not tell them, afraid she would be kept away from her husband. She stayed with Vasily until he died, absorbing radiation throughout. Her daughter was born 4 months later with congenital heart disease. The baby lived for 4 hours, The bodies of the firefighters were so radioactive they could not be buried normally. They were sealed in zinc coffins, placed inside wooden caskets, then buried in concrete at a Moscow cemetery. The families could not touch the coffins. They could not have traditional funerals. Even in death, the radiation separated them. The widows received pensions, apartments, official condolences. It was not enough. Nothing could be enough. They had lost their husbands to a fire that should never have happened, caused by a system that valued secrecy over safety. They would spend the rest of their lives with the memories. When the humans left Pripyat, the animals stayed behind. Dogs waited at apartment buildings for owners who would never return. Cats prowled empty streets. Livestock stood in fields and barns, unfed, unwatered. Pets that had been promised, "We'll be back in 3 days," were abandoned to slow starvation. The authorities decided the animals could not be allowed to leave the zone. They might carry contamination on their fur. They might spread radioactive material beyond the exclusion zone. The solution was extermination. Soldiers were sent into the zone to kill the animals. They shot dogs in the streets of Pripyat, cats in the apartments, livestock in the fields. They hunted through the forests, killing deer, wild boar, anything that moved. They left the bodies where they fell, too contaminated to bury, too numerous to collect. The killing was traumatic for the soldiers who carried it out. Many were young conscripts, ordered to shoot pets that came running toward them, tails wagging, expecting food and care. Some soldiers reportedly refused and were punished. Others followed orders and carried the memories forever. Not all animals were killed. Some escaped, fleeing into the forests. Over time, the exclusion zone became an accidental wildlife preserve. With humans gone, nature recovered. Wolves, wild horses, lynx, and even European bison now roam the zone. Bird populations have exploded. The forests have grown back, covering the ruins of villages. The zone is now one of the largest wildlife sanctuaries in Europe, a strange legacy of the disaster. The animals that live there are contaminated, carrying radioactive isotopes in their tissues. But they are alive. In the absence of humans, even a radioactive environment is survivable. If you're still listening, subscribe and leave a comment. Because now we need to follow the radioactive cloud as it drifted across a continent. The explosion at Chernobyl released approximately 400 times more radiation than the Hiroshima bomb. This material rose into the atmosphere in a plume that reached heights of several kilometers. From there, it was carried by the winds first northwest toward Scandinavia, then shifting with weather patterns to spread across Europe. The fallout was not evenly distributed. It followed the winds and the weather, concentrating where rain brought the particles back to Earth. Belarus received the heaviest contamination, with 70% of the fallout landing on its territory. Ukraine and Russia were also heavily affected, but significant contamination reached Poland, Germany, Austria, Italy, France, the United Kingdom, and Scandinavia. Each country discovered the contamination differently. Sweden found it first, when workers at Forsmark triggered radiation alarms. Finland detected elevated readings in air monitors. Western European countries noticed spikes in their environmental monitoring systems. Each discovery came before the Soviets admitted anything had happened. The health effects were real but diffuse. Across Europe, governments advised people to avoid fresh milk, to wash vegetables, to stay indoors during rain. Farmers destroyed crops and culled livestock. The contamination entered the food chain, spreading through dairy, meat, and vegetables. Decades later, elevated radiation levels could still be detected in mushrooms, game meat, and reindeer in parts of Scandinavia. The long-term health toll is impossible to calculate precisely. Estimates range from several thousand additional cancer deaths to tens of thousands, spread across millions of exposed people over decades. The deaths are statistical excess cancers that cannot be attributed to specific individuals, but they are real. Chernobyl's reach extended far beyond the exclusion zone. The acute deaths at Chernobyl numbered in the dozens. The long-term deaths number in the thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, and they continue to this day. Thyroid cancer was the most clearly linked effect. Radioactive iodine-131, released in massive quantities by the explosion, concentrated in the thyroid glands of those exposed, particularly children, who are more vulnerable. In the years following the disaster, thyroid cancer rates in Belarus and Ukraine skyrocketed, especially among those who were children in 1986, not by 2005. Approximately 6,000 cases of thyroid cancer had been diagnosed among those exposed as children. The good news is that thyroid cancer is usually treatable if caught early. The bad news is that treatable does not mean harmless. Patients require surgery, lifelong medication, and ongoing monitoring. Their lives are changed forever. Other health effects are more difficult to quantify. Studies of liquidators show elevated rates of leukemia, cardiovascular disease, cataracts, and psychological disorders. Studies of the general population show possible increases in various cancers, birth defects, and other conditions. But separating Chernobyl's effects from other factors, poverty, stress, poor health care, lifestyle, is methodologically difficult. The psychological toll may be the hardest to measure, but the easiest to see. Communities affected by Chernobyl show elevated rates of depression, anxiety, alcoholism, and suicide. The disaster destroyed not just bodies, but lives, communities scattered, livelihoods lost, futures foreclosed. People grew up in the shadow of the disaster, marked by it, defined by it. The dying continues. Every year, former liquidators succumb to cancers and other diseases. Every year, people in contaminated areas are diagnosed with conditions that may or may not be linked to exposure. Chernobyl is not history. It is ongoing. Nearly 4 decades after the explosion, Chernobyl is many things. A cautionary tale, a tourist destination, a wildlife sanctuary, and a still active nuclear site. The new safe confinement covers Reactor Number 4, its gleaming arch a strange monument to both disaster and engineering triumph. Inside, work continues to eventually dismantle the reactor and dispose of the radioactive material, a project expected to take decades and cost billions of dollars. Other 3 reactors at Chernobyl continued operating after the disaster reactor, 2 until 1991, Reactor 1 until 1996, Reactor 3 until 2000. Each shutdown was a complex, expensive process. The spent fuel from these reactors is still stored on site, awaiting final disposal in a facility that has not yet been built. Tourism to the exclusion zone has grown dramatically in recent years, boosted by the HBO miniseries that dramatized the disaster. Visitors can tour Pripyat, see the sarcophagus, visit the famous Ferris wheel. They wear dosimeters and are warned not to touch anything. Most receive radiation doses comparable to a dental X-ray minimal, but not zero. The zone remains contaminated. The red forest area is still hot. Hot spots can be found throughout Pripyat. The soil in many areas exceeds safe limits. Wildlife thrives, but the animals are not clean. They carry radioactive isotopes in their bodies, part of an ecosystem that has adapted to contamination rather than escaped at God. In February 2022, Russian forces seized Chernobyl during their invasion of Ukraine. Soldiers dug trenches in contaminated soil and reportedly received radiation doses. Control of the site returned to Ukraine in April. The war added another layer of danger to a place that was already dangerous enough. Chernobyl endures. It will endure for centuries, perhaps millennia. The exclusion zone may expand or contract, but it will not disappear. The reactor's tomb will need replacement again and again. The long-lived isotopes will continue to decay, slowly, imperceptibly, toward a safety that no living person will ever see. And so our journey through Chernobyl comes to an end. The reactor is still there, entombed in concrete and steel, its heart still molten and radioactive. The city of Pripyat stands empty, a monument to sudden absence, its apartments decaying, its amusement park never written. The zone stretches for 2,600 square kilometers of contaminated land, slowly being reclaimed by forests and wildlife, slowly decaying back into nature. But Chernobyl is not just a place. It is a warning. It warns us about the cost of secrecy. The Soviet system valued reputation over truth, ideology over safety. When the reactor exploded, the first instinct was to deny, to minimize, to control the narrative. This instinct cost lives that could have been saved by early warning, early evacuation, early action. The lies were as lethal as the radiation. It warns us about the cost of arrogance. The RBMK reactor had a fatal flaw, and the people who knew about it classified it rather than fix it. The operators who ran Reactor Number 4 were not told that their machine could destroy itself. The engineers who designed the safety test did not understand what they were asking the reactor to do. Knowledge was hidden, and ignorance killed. It warns us about the cost of hubris. The Soviet Union believed its technology was the best in the world, its engineers the most skilled, its systems infallible. This belief made it impossible to admit flaws, to learn from mistakes, to accept that things could go wrong. The Titanic sank because people thought it couldn't. Chernobyl exploded for the same reason. But Chernobyl also shows us something else: the extraordinary capacity of human beings to respond to disaster. The firefighters who climbed onto the burning roof did not know they were already dead. They knew only that there was a fire, and fires needed to be fought. They did their duty, and they saved the plant from even greater catastrophe. They were not heroes in the sense of choosing heroism. They were heroes in the sense of being ordinary people who did what needed to be done. The liquidators who shoveled graphite with their bare hands, who flew helicopters over the open reactor, who dug tunnels in killing heat, they knew what they faced. Many of them went anyway. They were motivated by patriotism, by duty, by money, by the simple understanding that someone had to do it. They sacrificed their health, their futures, their lives. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, consider the blue light over Pripyat. Consider the people who stood on the bridge, watching the fire, not knowing they were dying. Consider the children who played outside, absorbing poison with every breath. Consider the wives who held their husbands' hands, knowing the touch was killing them. Consider the operators in the control room the moment they realized what they had done. Consider Dyatlov insisting the core was intact while graphite burned on the ground. Consider the plant director sending minimized reports to Moscow while his reactor burned. And consider the cleanup crews who came after hundreds of thousands of ordinary people who did extraordinary things, who saved a continent from contamination, who paid with their health and their lives. Chernobyl teaches us that disasters are not natural. They are made by decisions, by systems, by the accumulated choices of people who could have chosen differently. The reactor did not have to explode. The warning signs were there. The opportunity to prevent it existed. The same is true of the disasters that await us. Climate change, pandemic disease, nuclear proliferation. Each has its warning signs, its opportunities for prevention, its choices to be made. We can learn from Chernobyl, or we can repeat it. The reactor is still burning, in a sense. The isotopes are still decaying. The zone is still contaminated. Chernobyl is not over. It is a process, not an event, a slow catastrophe that began in 1986 and will continue for thousands of years. Rest well tonight. Rest in a world shaped by Chernobyl, by its warnings and its lessons, by its heroes and its victims, by the invisible particles still drifting in the air. The reactor is contained. The danger remains. Remember Chernobyl. It is not history. It is a preview.